seeking out that which unites us. And I want you to feel the openness of our hearts and our home and feel as welcome as possible. Feel free to tour our sanctuary. In our world to come, there will be an all-you-can-eat buffet. So what we do when there's food out is we don't limit you just to the before and after. We want you to be able to partake throughout the evening. So feel free, if you need a drink or food, to make yourself at home. But we really do want you to feel at home. We want you to feel as if you have just been welcomed with open arms. And we are here to share with you in the spirit of unity.
Well, I have to admit it was really my fault that we started late, because I got here at 6:40 like they told me to, and then I met a new friend, Jane, and we were just standing in the corner and eating and talking, and they didn't know I was here.
I thought she was with the congregation.
I'm sorry. It's my fault.
I enjoy it.
It's friendship's fault, I guess we should say. And I also want to bring greetings from Burke Presbyterian Church, where I serve and have served for about 4 years now with my husband, Jarrett. It's a wonderful congregation of Presbyterians down the road, and many of them, except for one who's here, or sort of two, are celebrating our children's ministry tonight. We have a midweek kind of retreat for our young people, and it's our rainbow banquet tonight, and so that's where many of my friends are, but I'm glad to have new friends. So thank you for having me and for forgiving me for starting late. Last week I was with 16 other Presbyterian pastors for a yearly time of continuing education. Pastors of all kinds need nurture themselves. And so we were studying scripture together and talking about how it is that we care for God's people in the midst of this current climate. And I was charged with 2 scripture texts to present some information about. And one was the first account of the creation story in the book of Genesis. And part of that story says, God is speaking, and says, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Throughout the whole part of that story, God is singular, usually male. And then all of a sudden we get to this part of the story, and all of a sudden it's, let us create people in our image. And it's a little strange. And so many scholars will have lots of things to say, as scholars do. Some folks think it's sort of the divine council, God with the sort of heavenly court deciding together what to do about creating humans. Others somehow try to indicate that perhaps God contains both the male and the female. All of the scholars agree that the one that God creates, Ha-Adam, which isn't the proper name Adam, but the earthling, that one is both genders. It doesn't start out with the man. It starts out with the creature. And I found it really interesting in my research about this text, and knowing that I was coming to be with you friends. Is it Rashi? Is that the rabbi who's an interpreter? Am I saying the name right? I loved what he said, that God created Adam with 2 faces, then separated them. How lovely is that? God creates the creature as one, and then says, okay, now 2, and so we have Adam and Eve, the male and the female. So long before any tradition of hierarchy, there was an assertion of parity. And then I kept reading about this text, as you do, and I came upon Rumi. Rumi, who says, lovers, I was thinking, what does this mean for human relationships, right? Lovers don't finally meet somewhere. They are in each other all along, which I love. Men and women start in this beautiful, and I would add, holy equality. And I feel like it's important to say that. Men and women start and should remain equals in God's eyes and God's image. And especially in our day, I don't know how you feel about our day, and it's okay, however you feel. But I feel like we can't say that enough right now. That men and women are both created in God's good image. And I will admit that my tradition, Christian tradition, particularly Presbyterian tradition, hasn't been great about honoring that. We have been highlighting the ministry, the work of men for a long, long time. I come from an abnormally long line of Presbyterian ministers, so just want to say that. My great-great-great-grandfather was ordained into the Presbyterian Church in 1820. Wow. And there has been a male, of course, Presbyterian minister in my family ever since. We do not get very creative in our family. So pray for my 3 daughters. My paternal grandmother, Agnes Duncan Peery, went to college, which was significant in and of itself, and then biblical seminary in New York with a woman named Rachel Hinderlight. Rachel was the first woman ordained in the Southern Presbyterian Church in 1965. So, 1820? 1965. I count Rachel and my grandmother, who was never ordained, and my mother, who is ordained, as role models in the faith. But since you don't know them, I bet you could name some Christian women of the faith who have shaped our history together. Joan of Arc, Mother Teresa, Dorothy Day, Sojourner Truth, Alice Walker, Rosa Parks. These are names you may know a lot about or know a little about. But in my remaining, 5 minutes I want to talk a bit about how women who have had to play within the rules of the silence that faith and culture have impressed upon them, how they too have shaped history, and what we can learn from them. So maybe not role models in the way that you recognize their names, but nevertheless have something to say. I mentioned Rosa Parks. She's named as the First Lady of Civil Rights. A Christian woman, member of the AME Church in Montgomery, Alabama. You will remember from history maybe that on December 1st, 1955, she refused to give up her seat on the bus. And that eventually led to the statement that segregation on buses was deemed unconstitutional, part of the larger civil rights story. But behind Rosa Parks was a woman whose name you may not know. A Christian woman, youngest of 12 from Georgia, divorced, who moved to Montgomery to use her master's degree in English to teach at Alabama State College. Her name was Joanne Robinson. Has anyone heard her name? Rosa Parks was arrested on a Thursday night. And when she was, a phone call was made to Joanne Robinson, who was involved in the Women's Political Council in Montgomery, which was a group that was working on voter registration for African Americans. And Joanne agreed that the Women's Political Council should host and promote a one-day bus boycott, casting off old rules about how Negro women should never travel alone at night in southern towns. Robinson and two friends met at midnight at the office at Alabama State under the pretext of grading exams. If you're a teacher, you know you could grade exams or whatever. And they drafted a letter of protest. Another Negro woman has been arrested and thrown into jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus and give it to a white person, they began. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses on Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. As they worked on this sort of memo, these women felt urgency closing in upon them, and they realized that the best way to notify the Montgomery folks, given their lack of access to newspaper or radio, was to pass out leaflets throughout the churches and contacts of that women's council. And the best place to get copies of this letter or sort of flyer was right where they were, at Alabama State, on a mimeograph machine. So the women who arrived there at midnight and drafted this letter worked until 7 a.m. to make copies. Yes, whatever you were doing, that was the motion. And they did this mammoth task before daylight, never spoke to anyone about it. Joanne Robinson taught her class at Alabama State at 8 a.m. the next morning on a Friday. As it is with most historical movements, the start point of the Montgomery bus boycott is widely contested. Martin Luther King divided credit between Nixon and the Women's Political Council. The names of civil rights movement that most folks can recite without a book in front of them are MLK, Rosa Parks, maybe a few others. Clearly, God used these folks in God's work. But there are other names of folks who played a role where God was quietly working within history, and Joanne Robinson was one of those. The three of us share stories of the prophet Elijah. And in the book of Kings, there's this great story about God coming to Elijah, and Elijah's real bummed about God's people not doing right. And God says, go stand on the mountain, the Lord's going to pass by. I don't know if you remember this story. And there's a great wind so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks into pieces, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And that's where God begins to speak. That's where God showed up. I feel like we all could tell stories of how women have been relegated to silent work. In the home, in the church, in the synagogue, in the mosque, wherever we may show up. But let us remember that God isn't locked into any specific way of working. God's voice can be present at a podium on the Washington Mall, at the heart of a woman sitting on a bus, and also locked up in an office, found in the hum of a mimeograph machine.
I'll just hold it. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Great. It's pretty hard to follow in the footsteps of a reverend and then a rabbi. I'll admit that I'm actually a little intimidated being up here today. My name is Riham Osman, and I work with the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So I'm not a religious scholar. I'm a digital media strategist, and I work for a public policy organization. So a lot of my day-to-day work is engaging with our online audience and putting out positive stories and accurate stories about the American Muslim community. And my day is mainly spent on social media, and after going through all the negative news, almost every single day, I always find positive stories. And those stories are usually about Muslim women. They're usually stories about Muslim women who are breaking barriers, who are becoming Olympists, who are becoming boxers, who are doing all these incredible things. And it's not hard for me to find those stories. So it's always hard for me to remind myself that the vast majority of people are not seeing those stories. The vast majority of people, when they're going online, they're seeing Muslim women who are living in very harsh circumstances, who are dressed in all black and completely covered, and who are not allowed to speak. That's what the majority of people are seeing online. And my job is to counter those stereotypes. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I didn't actually right away think about those modern time stories. I thought about more the historical stories, the stories in Islam that I pretty much grew up on. I grew up on the stories of the Prophet Muhammad's wives, as weird as it may sound to many people. And I grew up on the story of Asya, the wife of Pharaoh, and what she went through. So today, to narrow it down to just, I think, 2 women I wanted to talk about was actually pretty difficult. So today I just want to briefly talk about Khadijah, one of the Prophet's wives. She was actually the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, Khadijah, she was a businesswoman. And it's crazy to think because at that time, women were not businesswomen. Women really weren't really allowed to, just go out there into society. And it's not because of Islam, it's just the culture of the time. That's just how things were in society. It was a really difficult time to be a woman in general. So for Khadijah to have been a businesswoman and a successful one at that, that's remarkable. And it wasn't that she became a businesswoman after she married the Prophet Muhammad, or after she proposed to him, actually. So she was a widow twice, and she didn't actually need a man. The Prophet Muhammad actually kind of needed her more than she needed him. She's the one who had the money. He didn't have the money in that sort of way to support a wife. So she came and she proposed to him. And her father was also a businessman. So essentially, after he passed away, she took on his business. They didn't pass on the business to someone else. She stood up and she took it on, and she had a booming business. And like I said, at the time, it's a dangerous time to be a woman in that society. So for her to be trading those goods obviously was not going to work. So what she did was she hired men to go into those dangerous trade routes and trade the goods for her. So that was honestly the first one I thought about. Just especially today, you do see a lot more Muslim women going into corporate America, and Khadijah is an example for many of them. And the second example I want to highlight is Aisha. She was also one of the wives of prophets after Khadijah passed away, and she was the daughter of one of his companions. And what stands out about Aisha is that she was a scholar. And she was a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence. And the reason that stands out to me is because oftentimes a lot of the negative things you hear about Islam, it goes back to just really bad translations of the Quran and things that were not, translated by women. So to know that she was one of those people interpreting the Quran at the time, I think that's really something that stands out to me. And she was teaching men. She wasn't only, keeping that knowledge to herself. She was a scholar and she was teaching men, and men were coming to her and wanting to learn from her. So I think I'll stop right there. I'd be happy to take questions. I'm definitely more interested in hearing what you all have to say than what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you both for your inspirational words, and something that I was thinking of as you were both speaking is all 3 of us were given this pretty ambitious title and told, okay, say something about this in a few minutes. And I envision all of us, individually in front of our computer screens trying to figure this out. And I think individually from all our different perspectives, I think there's a lot of universal themes that are actually weaving through all of them. And that's kind of exciting to me. So a number of years ago, I had an informal lunch with a group that included the editor of a Jewish family magazine. And he said, I'm thinking of publishing a story about how women rabbis have changed the rabbinate, and by extension, Judaism. That previously, when rabbis were all men, rabbis were more about heaviness and authority. And as women come into leading congregations, they bring nurturing and softness into their role. So, people are thinking of Judaism and God differently. So I took a moment to think about the individuals that were in my rabbinical school with me. And I thought about my male classmates and my female classmates. And then I responded, when I think about the men and women that I was in school with, I don't really think they broke down that way. Actually, a lot of the women in my class were maybe more on the heady side and more like CEO types. And I think a lot of men in my class were actually, pretty nurturing people. And he looked at me and said, well, remind me not to interview you for my story. So I open with this anecdote because I believe that the issue of what women of faith contribute to society at large might not actually reside in who individual women really are at our core, our intrinsic traits and our interests. For every personality trait, every intellectual ability, every creative talent that we can imagine lies within many men and also within many women. I believe the contributions of women of faith are more about how women, who historically have been allowed fewer options to bring our skills and talents out into the greater world, have served as role models for everyone who's been held back by preconceived notions of who they are and what they can achieve. So when I think back over just even the past century of women from the Jewish community whose contributions have brought them national and international attention, I think of writers and artists, politicians and scientists, teachers and rabbis, social activists and leaders of movements. Just a tiny sampling of such women are the military hero and poet Hannah Senesh, who sacrificed herself resisting Nazism. Poet and activist for the rights of immigrants, Emma Lazarus, whose inspirational words, "Give me your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," grace the Statue of Liberty. The 5 Jewish women who have won a Nobel Prize for Science, including most recently in 2009, Ada Yonat. To each of these women, Judaism, in a personal and unique way, helped bring them inspiration and a drive to work toward a goal that would make the world a better place, a safer place, a more compassionate place. They successfully pursued their sacred work despite the ways that society's stereotypes may have worked against them. And as other women see their successful striving toward their high goals, in turn, they are empowered to pursue their own passions. A well-known Jewish biblical figure who I find intriguing is the hero and the namesake of her biblical book, Esther. Esther, a Jewish woman who hides her religious identity in order to become the wife of the king of Persia, is faced with a terrible dilemma. Her people, the Jews, are to be wiped out due to an evil power play by the king's advisor, Haman. The Jews are powerless to do anything, and they look to Queen Esther to save them. But she is extremely limited in her access to real power, to anything we would think of as power. She is not, by Persian law, even allowed to approach the king without his taking the initiative. After a great deal of thought, she uses cleverness, ingenuity, psychology, and creativity, the only tools available to her, to hatch a plan which involves big parties and well-placed conversation that ends up saving the Jews of Persia. She is not a big splashy military hero. She's not, as the pastor shared, in the fire or the earthquake or the big splashes. The way she works to defend the innocent doesn't match our preconceived ideas of what it means to save the day. But she is a hero nonetheless. The book of Esther is a story that our tradition has found very powerful and very resonant through the ages. It recognized that there are many ways to achieve great things, many ways to be a hero, many ways to contribute to the bettering of our world. Many heroes in the real world never make it into the history books. This has certainly been true for a number of women over the centuries, but they are heroes nonetheless. I began with an anecdote about the ways that we bring our assumptions about people into our encounters with them. How we may make snap judgments based on not only gender, but also cultural or ethnic background, socioeconomic position, age, religion, or country of origin. One important contribution of women of faith: as women of faith continue to move into all types of positions of authority and leadership, it compels all of us to confront the stereotypes that we bring to every encounter, each and every day. This social change broadens the answers to questions such as, who has something valuable to share? Whose ideas and opinions matter? What does it mean to be a hero? Who should be around a table when decisions are made? These are religious questions. All people of faith ultimately aim to see every person as equally created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and treat them as such. I believe that the increased recognition of the diverse contributions of women of faith move us all closer to this sacred and important goal, an ideal human family that interacts with respect, with compassion, and in peace. Thank you.